Mark Swenson to talk about Point Roberts' mistake or theft, or as the events, come on up, Mark, or as the events board says, thanks to some member of the community, or maybe neither, or maybe propaganda, we're not sure. So Mark has lived in Point Roberts for over 21 years. 4 generations of his family, going back to his great-grandfather, fished at Point Roberts. His grandfather brought the mail by boat from Bellingham to Point Roberts in the 1930s when, as frequently happened, the regular boat, the famous Tulip, was in dry dock. Mark is a senior strategist for an AI software company and a stamp dealer. He holds a BA in political economics from Evergreen State College in Olympia. Mark is the president of the Point Roberts Historical Society, and he is the author of the 2017 book, Point Roberts Backstory, Tales, Trails, and Trivia from an American Exclave. It's a great read, by the way, and if you haven't read it, you need to, if you're interested in Point Roberts.
Mark.
And signed copies will be available.
Over here.
Oh, I was going to say at the registration, they'll be at the reserve table, and yeah, and so please think about coming up and getting a copy. And after Mark's presentation, we'll take a short 5-minute break, and then we'll go into open forum if people, so wish to discuss other issues or give suggestions and direction to the board of directors. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mark, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks to the board and members of the Point Roberts Taxpayers Association and members of the general public that are here tonight. Allow me just for a moment to reflect on this beautiful setting. If we go back 90 years to a Thursday afternoon like this in July in 1934, my grandpa was probably tying up his boat here on the township pier. He was under contract by the Waters brothers to carry the mail from Bellingham when the Tulip wasn't running. So he would have likely taken the mail into the post office and then gone next door to the Waters store to get paid, which is right over here where the Julius Real Estate building is approximately, on the old Front Street. Then Grandpa might have gone across the street to the Breakers to have a beer before heading back to Bellingham. The Breakers had just opened in 1934. That was 1 year after Prohibition ended. And so that was a new establishment right across the street. The Point's largest economic engine then were fish traps. And fish traps had just been banned in 1934. So for the first time in 56 years that year, looking out at the Salish Sea right here, we would not see fish traps. The large fixed structures with the nets and the pens. Point Roberts was quickly adapting its economy and its tax base, as it has had to do before then, and many times after. But I digress. We need for tonight's topic to go back another 90 years to the 1840s. As members of a taxpayer association, I know you value the importance of accurate information. Everybody here has a vested interest in Point Roberts, and so as taxpayers and citizens, we should use a common set of facts and a shared understanding of our community's roots. So let's be sure we're getting the facts about the history of Point Roberts correct. Are there any readers of Slate.com in the audience tonight? It's a daily online magazine. No one reads Slate.com. It's surprising. Slate.com has 25 million active readers. And most of the time, some good journalism in there. Now, in April 2016, Slate.com, 4 years before the pandemic, wrote a very typical article about Point Roberts. And I'm going to read you 3 sentences from this article, and then we can take a quick poll, show of hands, as to whether Slate.com got it right, you agree. If they got it wrong, you disagree. All right, so here we go from Slate.com. Quote, due to the limited knowledge of the region's geography at the time, there was one land area that both the Americans and the British failed to notice, Point Roberts, the Point Roberts Peninsula. This peninsula was unknown at the time, but once discovered, it was too late. The agreement had accidentally cut off a piece of Canada and given it to the United States. End quote. Is this your understanding of the history of Point Roberts?
No.
Let's see. By show of hands, how many people, I'll ask if you agree partially, or disagree. So, how many people agree with that write-up? Nobody, okay. Mark, what am I doing here? Yeah, I don't know. Anyone think they got it part right? Part of it's right, part of it's wrong? Okay, a few hands. And how many people think they got it all wrong? All right. Well, I'll reveal the answer as we go through the presentation. So, since the Point Roberts Historical Society opened the Point Roberts History Center just down the street here in August 2019, we interact with visitors to Point Roberts. And many are coming to Point Roberts just because it's an exclave. There's a growing amount of exclave tourism. There's actually travel agents who have specialized tours to visit the exclaves of the world. And many people come here to Point Roberts and stop in at the History Center just to say they've been to an exclave and to try it out, see how hard it is to get here. And we get hundreds and hundreds of visitors a year in the History Center. And they come from all over the world, near and far, and many are very, very curious about our history, our geography, and how we became an exclave. It has become clear, however, that we have some problems with the popular belief of the history of Point Roberts. Many people come in with an incorrect understanding of our history. And we hear these myths in the History Center, we hear them in correspondence to the Historical Society, and we view and read them online in videos and blogs and articles. And in this digital era, these online postings, which sometimes get it wrong, are quickly propagated elsewhere online and then are cited as sources for others. In short, the wrong version of our history feels like it's growing faster at times than a true and accurate version of our history, and that's concerning. As taxpayers, we all need to be on the same page. So as president of the Historical Society, I'm here tonight to correct some popular myths about the history of Point Roberts. The title of this speech is Point Roberts, Mistake or Theft? And because there are large pluralities of people who believe Point Roberts history does involve theft and or a mistake. All right, so let's start with the biggest myth. Some people believe that Point Roberts' status as U.S. territory was because it was an unplanned accident or a mistake, that there was an unknown peninsula here that ended up being bisected by the 49th parallel. This belief goes that when Britain and the United States negotiated in the 1846 Treaty of Washington, that the border would go west from the Continental Divide down to the Strait of Georgia, following the 49th parallel, that no one had been here. That there were no maps, or existing maps were vague or inaccurate. And that nobody knew there was a peninsula here, much less that it would be cut off, thus creating an exclave. This theory goes on to say that when engineers finally reached Point Roberts to physically mark the border on the ground and cut a swath through the forest and plant those boundary markers, that they were amazed to find that there's land west of Blaine, an unknown surprise peninsula. Thus, many people truly believe that Point Roberts was an accident, that it is a mistake. Ladies and gentlemen, this is false. Yay. This is not our history.
Yay.
It's not true that nobody knew a peninsula was here. I'm sorry, but by 1858, the year the British engineers arrived here, kind of everybody knew there was a peninsula here. 1858 is very late in the history of the Salish Sea to find a significant landmass with 200-foot-tall cliffs on the shoreline of the Salish Sea. Think about 1858, the middle of the 1850s. Fort Langley's been there since the 1820s. Fort Victoria opened in 1843, and there's significant traffic going back and forth between these two forts right here. They're going right by Point Roberts. The Hudson's Bay Company fort at Fort Langley traded salmon with the native peoples from Point Roberts. And Point Roberts features frequently in the logs at Fort Langley. So, lots of traffic going here. Moreover, there were maps. Lots of maps. The Spanish had maps. The British had maps. The Americans had maps. Even the French had maps. They weren't even party to the deal. We are labeled on Spanish maps as early as 1791. George Vancouver mapped and named Point Roberts in 1792. Even slept here on shore 2 different Fridays that month. So the British knew we were here. And some people say, okay, Mark, I get it. People knew the peninsula was here, but no one had confirmed that the peninsula extends below the 49th parallel. No one had measured that yet. No one had confirmed it. They hadn't brought engineers here to, use their instruments to prove that. So surely the mistake myth is correct in that wasn't proven. We didn't know that the peninsula was so long. Only when engineers got here did we know that. Nope, that's not true. The United States Navy sent Charles Wilkes here to the Salish Sea in 1841. Right? This is 17 years before the British engineers arrived. This is half a decade before the Treaty of Washington. And the famous Wilkes expedition mapped every shoal, which was his marching orders. Wilkes and 6 ships from the U.S. Navy came to these waters. They spent a half a day in Semiahmoo Bay, over by the Peace Arch. That's the first place that the 49th parallel hits salt water. So they spent a half a day kind of confirming where that line would be. Compared to that, they spent 8 days at Point Roberts. 8 days measuring this peninsula every different which way, triangulating different measurements, also taking soundings in the water. And on July 7th, 1841, in their logs that were communicated to Congress and the Secretary of State, the Wilkes expedition proves and writes in their journals that Point Roberts will be an exclave if the 49th parallel is used as was anticipated, and that Point Roberts is within the territorial claim of the United States. Okay, so there's people going back and forth between forts. There's maps. Another reason why we should know that the Point Roberts Peninsula extends below the 49th parallel is that by the time the British engineers arrived here in 1858, there's people living here below the 49th parallel, right? Robertstown has been built, exists. Just down here, just down the beach, just past Freeman Beach, kind of between there and the Yellow Cannery. That settlement, as short-lived as it was part of the Fraser River Gold Rush, which started arguably in Point Roberts. The gold wasn't here, obviously, but the rush part was. Right? A guy came down from the gold fields, tried to sell liquor to the American engineers marking the border. This is in November 1857. And was arrested. That's not cool to do. They frisked him, found the gold in his pockets, and soon news reached Seattle and San Francisco, and the very next day people are coming here. So there's actually a settlement on Point Roberts prior to when the mistake myth says that we couldn't know if there was a peninsula here, right? That settlement, by the way, had 2 hotels that even the British dignitaries were sleeping in as they went back and forth between forts. I mean, by 1858, that's so late. The towns around Bellingham Bay have been there for well over half a decade, and there's many documented reports of white people fishing here at Point Roberts in the early 1850s. So, as the late great Ruby White emphatically stated when I interviewed her for my book, they knew we were here. So, it's not true that people didn't know there was a peninsula here. It's not true that they didn't know that the peninsula extended below the 49th parallel. That is not true. That is not our history. This part of the mistake myth is false. To answer half the title of the presentation, Point Roberts is not a mistake. But the myth doesn't end there. The popular narrative continues with a little bit more. It says that when it was discovered that Point Roberts was an exclave, that the United States didn't give Point Roberts back to Britain. There's a belief that after the British engineers got here, Britain formally asked the United States for Point Roberts to be part of Britain, and the United States either ignored that request or refused. The popular myth says that Point Roberts is theft. Ladies and gentlemen, that is also false, but let's unpack that one a little bit more. There is some nuance to this. What they're often referring to is an offer by Britain to zigzag the border in Boundary Bay so that the Point Roberts Peninsula wouldn't be cut off. Pop quiz time. A mile and a third up the road, Monument Park. There's an obelisk. It's boundary marker number 1. Who knows the name? There's some people's names on the obelisk. Anyone know the name of the person on the north side of the obelisk facing Canada?
Marshall?
I like Mark Robbins. I can't hear, so I don't know why I'm doing the quiz, but okay. That guy's name is James Prevost. I don't know if whoever shouted out a name got that right. But James Prevost's boss, back in London, is a guy named Lord Clarendon. He has a much longer title and name, but that's his title. And in December of 1856, when there's not supposed to be a peninsula known here, Lord Clarendon is sitting in London thinking about little old Point Roberts. Probably at the urgency of Prevost, but that's my own conjecture. And Lord Clarendon authorizes Prevost to ask for Point Roberts, but to do it on the down low. Clarendon says that this has not been communicated to the government of the United States through any proper channels. Instead of a formal request for Point Roberts through the Secretary of State or the President, Prevost is supposed to quietly ask his local American counterpart for Point Roberts, under the guise that administering an exclave would be a pain for the Americans, and that Point Roberts, quote, cannot be of the slightest value to the United States. Prevost is told by Clarendon, the American will probably not object. Quote, that's a quote. Anyone know I don't know why I'm asking, but anyone know the name of the American counterpart whose name's also on the obelisk, the south side of the obelisk?
Marshall?
Commissioner Archibald Campbell. All right, so Lord Clarendon says Point Roberts cannot be of the slightest value to the United States, but Charles Wilkes and the Wilkes expedition had found the opposite. What Wilkes reports back to Congress and the Secretary of State were three things. That one, Point Roberts is, if the 49th parallel were to become the boundary, within the territorial claim of the United States, and that there is good navigation to other ports south of the 49th parallel, namely Drayton Harbor and Birch Bay. Two, that Point Roberts has very strong, abundant natural resources, chief among them salmon. Wilkes had gone up to Fort Langley, seen all the salmon, been told all of this comes from Point Roberts. They returned to Point Roberts, and with a newfound appreciation for the resources here, and spend several more days mapping it. And thirdly, that Point Roberts has a strategic location near the mouth of the Fraser River. Wilkes was fascinated by the Fraser River. He was hoping beyond hope that there was one branch of the Delta that came below the 49th parallel somewhere. Of course, that's not true, and he found that that was not true, but he said, nonetheless, Point Roberts and the United States are lucky to have a strategic piece of land just a few hundred meters or yards from the mouth of the river. He anticipated in his writing that a great city would grow up at the mouth of the Fraser River. He was correct about that, and thus he stressed how strategic this land was to the United States. And so when Campbell is here, working with and negotiating with Prevost, Campbell is working with a very different perspective, informed by Wilkes, than Lord Clarendon has told Prevost. Nonetheless, Prevost does bring this up with Campbell. He does this in December of 1857. He does not do this in writing. There is no letter of Britain or even just Prevost asking for Point Roberts. This is done verbally on board a ship. Just Prevost and Campbell. So it's a verbal meeting. And Prevost's timing couldn't be worse. To put this in context, in 1857, chief among them, there were tensions escalating in the San Juan Islands. We're building up to the pig war. The pig had not been shot. Pig's not shot till 1859. The shooting of the pig didn't spark the pig war. There was tensions for several years leading up to that. Hudson's Bay Company was taxing American farmers on Lopez Island. The Americans, in retaliation, were taxing per head of sheep on the English farms on San Juan Island. And so there's massive disputes there. And that's number one thing that they were talking about. Number two, why this is bad timing in December 1857 is there's already engineers here marking the border. Now, these aren't British engineers. They were the last on the scene. There were the American engineers. The American engineers came here in the summer of 1857 and had already started. British engineers didn't arrive till the following summer. But there was already engineers cutting down trees, physically marking the border. And three, the Fraser River Gold Rush. There's this noisy, rambunctious, bustling town here that's causing problems for everybody. And so it's in that context that Prevost is trying to bring up the fact that he wants to take Point Roberts. Campbell refuses to talk about this. He says there's three reasons why we are not having this conversation. Number one, that a discussion like that is above Campbell's pay grade. He says, if you want to talk about ceding territory, you got to go up the chain of command. This needs to be a proper government request, very formal and official in Washington, D.C., with the Secretary of State, the Ambassador, or the President. Number two, this treaty didn't just happen, Prevost. This treaty happened 11 years ago. This is old business. We're already marking the border. And number three, this is not on the agenda. We have all this stuff going on. San Juan Islands is why I'm here, right? The engineers, the gold rush. What are you talking about? So, Campbell did not say no. Campbell said, I'm not the guy who can talk about this. Right? This obviously needs to go through official government channels. And Britain never did that. No formal, official request was ever made by Britain to the United States government. Now, we don't have to wonder what the answer would be. Had they gone to Washington, D.C., in less than 2 years, the United States government took over Point Roberts and made it a military reservation, and it remained in federal hands for a half-century thereafter. And Mark's editorializing here right now. But I suspect this wasn't even about the convenience of administering an exclave. I think there was concern by the British for the growth and strategic location of Point Roberts, very close to sites that were important to Britain. Indeed, 5 months after this attempt to ask for Point Roberts, right offshore, right here, is parked a British warship, at times 2 of them, blockading Point Roberts, preventing miners from Robertstown from going into the mouth of the Fraser unless they paid for a permit. And in today's dollars, that permit would cost $150. I also will add on that sometimes we see some strong reactions when people come into the History Center, and they often do point their finger, and say, "You didn't give it back. You didn't give Point Roberts back. Give it back."
We never had it.
I'm sorry, but the fact of the matter is Point Roberts never belonged exclusively to Britain. Can't give something back to someone who never owned it. From 1818 to 1846, all of the state of Washington, all of the state of Oregon, and most of the province of British Columbia, in their current forms, were jointly held territory between the United States and Britain. Britain owned Oregon as much as the United States owned British Columbia. So you can't give Point Roberts back to a country it never exclusively belonged to. Therefore, the United States did not steal Point Roberts from Britain. Britain never exclusively owned it. The US was never officially asked for it. So in the end, the article from Slate.com, at least the 3 sentences that I read, none of that is true. And I'm glad to see most people voted that way. The unfortunate part is that story's out there, and many just like it. Even our Wikipedia page is wrong. And as for the title of the presentation, Point Roberts, mistake or theft, the answer is an emphatic neither. Point Roberts is not a mistake and was not stolen from the British. Do I have time for a sidebar? If we're going to talk about, theft in the history of Point Roberts, probably the biggest theft in the history of Point Roberts is the theft of Lily Point from the Lummies. The Lummies were promised in the 1853 Point Elliott Treaty that they would be able to fish in their usual and accustomed fishing grounds in Article 5. So even though their reservation lands are at Gooseberry Point, near Bellingham, Lily Point was identified as their usual and accustomed fishing ground. At one point, a gentleman named John Waller moves to Point Roberts and settles. I should say that he squatted, and he squatted at Lily Point in the Lily Point lowlands. And Waller is famous for constructing the first fish trap north of the Columbia in the state of Washington, right here at Point Roberts. And Waller builds a fence around the lowlands of Lily Point. That's a lot of wood. Where did Waller get so much wood that he could build a fence all the way around the lowlands of Lily Point? The Lummies show up one day and have the indignity of watching Waller disassemble the 6 Coast Salish longhouses that we had at Lily Point, and using the wood from their own homes to build a fence to keep them off of their treaty-protected fishing grounds. The Lummies petitioned the Bureau of Indian Affairs as early as the 1870s and repeatedly after that. And the BIA said, "Why are you trying to fish? Try farming." He said that to the Lummies, whose flag says the Salmon tribe. In 1894, there are 20 fish traps on the Lily Point Reef. In that same year, Wadhams, who had built a cannery on Lily Point the previous year, sold that cannery and his fish traps to the Alaska Packers Association. And the following year, in 1895, the Lummies sued the Alaska Packers Association for not allowing them to fish on their treaty-protected grounds, and that case went to the United States Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the Lummies did not prevail in that case. That's a longer discussion, but 5 years later, by 1900, the catch of salmon at Lily Point was 5.1 million pounds of salmon. And of that 5.1 million pounds of salmon, 5 million pounds were caught by white people. The 0.1 is the Lummies' share. Theft, indeed. To learn more about the history of the Point, I hope you're visiting the Point Roberts History Center, the Point's first museum. Come on in, spend an hour or two looking at our timeline wall, our genealogy database, our exhibits, our archives. You can exit through the gift shop. It's in the community center on this street. It's open Saturdays year-round, Sundays in the summer. Also, check out the new Point Roberts History Trail. This is a series of 24 historical interpretive signs that we've placed all over Point Roberts. It's a really fun outdoor activity for locals, cabin owners, and genuine tourists. And we will have some books for sale after the meeting. But in closing, I hope that setting the record straight with facts is inspiring, maybe reassuring to this group of taxpayers. When outsiders see Point Roberts, they see an illogical location and they see inconvenience. So the facts are important in a binational, nation-bridging exclave. Thank you so much for your attention and your open-mindedness to the true story of our shared, unique history. I hope my remarks have been informative, and perhaps I even changed some minds. Let's all go forward telling an accurate history of Point Roberts.
Yeah.
Thank you.